In 2025, a belated miracle rises from the shadows of 45 years of despair. A 2-year-old girl who vanished in a peaceful neighborhood in Nevada in 1975 has been found alive, grown up, and completely unaware that she was once the center of a cold case that left her biological family living and waiting for half a century. Just a short time earlier, the truth hit her like an unexpected blow. The name she had carried throughout her life was not her own. The family she called home was not where she was born, and somewhere out there were people who had never stopped calling her name in desperation. Today, I will plunge you straight into the eye of the storm of a tragedy that lasted nearly half a century. What really happened on that fateful afternoon in 1975, who took Margaret Ramirez away from her family's arms, and how a child who disappeared without a trace could grow up peacefully under a completely different identity. This is not just a disappearance, this is a brutal story about time, about stolen identity, about dusty files, and people who never stopped hoping. This is also one of the most intense, painful, yet humane journeys of rebirth that the true crime genre has ever witnessed. Take a deep breath, because right now we are about to step together into a story that could leave you breathless, not because of death, but because of the truth surviving after decades of silence. Before diving deep into this shocking real case file, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys seeking forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe to join us in the upcoming stories. Nevada in 1975 was a place far enough from centers of power that people believed bad things only happened elsewhere, a state of sunshine, wide roads, expanding residential areas around Las Vegas and Henderson, where working families moved in with the belief that they could raise their children in a safe environment, isolated from the unrest of big cities. In Henderson, life moved slowly. Neighbors knew each other by face, kids played in front yards, house doors were often left unlocked all day, and adults believed that turning their back for just a moment couldn't lose anything important. The Ramirez family lived right in that context, an unremarkable family, no scandals, not wealthy, not poor, with a father working shifts, a mother staying home to care for the kids, days passing according to a routine so familiar, it was almost invisible, mornings preparing meals, midday cleaning, afternoons with children playing within adult sight, evenings with the family gathering in the gentle fatigue of daily labor. Margaret Ramirez, just 2 years old, was the natural center of that space, a small child with unsteady steps, still babbling speech, clumsy but energetic movements, accustomed to clinging to adults, to the home yard, to the faces she saw every day, and so no one in the family thought that in just a short time, the little girl's presence could vanish without leaving a sound loud enough to raise alarm. The direct witness that day was a close relative, someone who regularly watched Margaret and knew her habits well, a relationship close enough that vigilance gradually gave way to routine, familiar enough that anything slightly unusual was easily explained as a harmless coincidence. The afternoon unfolded like any other, sunlight shining on the yard, sparse traffic sounds, the lazy atmosphere of a quiet residential area, until a situation arose that didn't quite fit that familiarity. A small detail that caught the witness's attention for a moment. Perhaps a stranger standing too long, an out-of-context greeting, or a presence that didn't belong there, but the initial reaction was not alarm, but self-reassurance, the belief that one shouldn't make a big deal when there was no clear reason. That moment of hesitation, that very human delay, created a short but sufficient gap in time for everything to slip out of control, when Margaret, in the natural curiosity of a 2-year-old, moved out of the familiar safe range, when the witness turned away to do something else, when no one heard a cry for help, because there might have been no cry at all. The disappearance happened quickly, without chaos, without signs of violence, without unusual sounds, just a sudden absence discovered later, when the witness turned back and no longer saw Margaret in sight, when the first few seconds passed with the thought that she had just gone elsewhere. then the next few minutes with growing worry, then real panic when her name was called with no response. The Ramirez family reacted instinctively, spontaneously searching the house, the yard, around the neighborhood, asking neighbors, trying to fill the widening void with action, but each passing minute only made it clearer that Margaret was no longer there, that no one had seen her leave, that there was no simple explanation for this disappearance. Panic gradually replaced the initial belief in safety. Guilt began to form in unspoken thoughts, and in that context, the family reached the unavoidable decision, the decision to report to the police, an action marking the boundary between the normal life that had just ended and a completely different reality that had just begun. The Ramirez family's missing person report call was received in a context where every detail had just happened while still fresh, when panic hadn't settled yet, and the timelines in the minds of those involved were still confused between reality and hope, and that very fact made the initial intake of information decisive for the entire subsequent process. For the report center in Henderson, this was not a routine call, because a 2-year-old child vanishing from a familiar living environment, in broad daylight, automatically triggered the highest alert level in the response system at that time, where every procedure was built around the assumption that every passing minute could reduce the chances of finding the victim safely. Assessing the priority level of the case was done almost immediately, based on Margaret's age, the circumstances of the disappearance without a clear explanation, and the fact that no adult had directly witnessed the moment she slipped out of control. All these factors led to the case being classified as high-risk missing, meaning the police force was not allowed to delay or handle it by waiting for additional information. The nearest patrol units were dispatched to the scene as quickly as possible, with the first goal not immediate searching, but preserving the area where Margaret was last seen, to avoid spontaneous activities by the family and neighbors inadvertently disturbing the already fragile initial signs. When the first officers arrived, the atmosphere at the scene was controlled chaos, the family in extreme distress, the direct witness trying to recount what happened, but unable to provide an exact timeline, and in that context, the police's priority task was to separate emotions from information, requiring everyone to stop spontaneous searching and focus on providing as specific data as possible. Determining the disappearance timeframe became the focus right from the first minutes, because only by clarifying the period when Margaret might have left adult supervision could the investigators envision the potential radius of her movement, and this required reconstructing a continuous chain of events from before the discovery of the disappearance up to when the call was made. Questions revolved around Margaret's last activities, the position where she was last seen, the people present in the area at that time, and any detail, no matter how small, it seemed irrelevant, because in child disappearance cases, the overlooked details are often the only remaining pieces. Collecting preliminary information in this phase was not aimed at concluding, but at creating an initial picture broad enough to not miss any approach, and so the police recorded every account, even conflicting or uncertain information, rather than dismissing it immediately. The direct witness was asked to recount the entire sequence from memory, from the first moment noticing something unusual to discovering Margaret was gone, while other family members were asked about the child's habits, places she often went, and any changes in daily routine that could create an opportunity for an unusual situation. In parallel with collecting statements, the police conducted a quick check of the surrounding area to determine if there were signs that Margaret might have wandered out of the familiar range on her own, but in this phase, the goal was not wide-area searching, but confirming no simple explanation was overlooked. Approaching the scene also included assessing the general safety of the area, examining entry and exit points, possible routes leading out of the residential area, and determining, if in the identified time frame there was any notable activity, all to serve the next step of assessing the possibility of external interference. Throughout this process, time pressure was clearly present. because every passing minute not only increased the family's anxiety, but also raised questions about whether reporting to the police had happened soon enough, and that pressure made every decision in the investigation launch phase based on incomplete information. However, for the responding force, this was the familiar reality of child disappearances, where there was no prior preparation, no perfect script, and every action had to be taken under uncertainty, with the assumption that inaction could cause more serious consequences than any errors from hasty action. When the report intake and initial assessment phase ended, one thing had become clear to everyone at the scene: Margaret's disappearance could not be explained by simple assumptions, and from that moment, the case officially entered emergency investigation status, where every subsequent decision would be measured by the ability to bring the little girl back safely, while no one could be sure they still had enough time to do so. As the report intake and emergency assessment phase concluded, the investigation force's focus immediately shifted to systematically collecting statements, because in the first hours after a child goes missing, witnesses' and relatives' memories are still close enough to the event to reconstruct the sequence, though the stress and panic simultaneously distort how people remember time and details. The primary witness, the last confirmed to have been with Margaret before she vanished, was separated from other family members to avoid mutual influence during recollection, and was asked to recount the entire sequence as linearly as possible, starting from how that afternoon unfolded, where Margaret was, what she was doing, who was in the area, and what drew the witness's attention right before realizing the child was no longer in sight. The initial statement was fragmented, not because the witness was deliberately hiding anything, but because the seemingly trivial details of an ordinary day are rarely remembered precisely in terms of time, and this made the mentioned minutes and hours more estimates than exact. In parallel with recording the primary witness's statement, other Ramirez family members were questioned separately about what they knew, from Margaret's daily habits, activities that day, to whether anyone had appeared around the house or area with unusual behavior. And at this phase, investigators were not seeking absolute consistency, but intersections between the stories. As the statements were placed side by side, small inconsistencies gradually emerged, not in the form of denials but discrepancies in sequence. For example, one person believing Margaret was last seen a few minutes earlier than another's estimate, or a detail the primary witness deemed unimportant being remembered more clearly by a relative. Cross-referencing timelines became a repetitive process, where investigators repeatedly returned to the same question phrased differently, to check memory consistency, while eliminating details likely influenced by post-event speculation. From this process, an initial timeline was constructed, not complete but sufficient to identify a key period, the period when Margaret likely left adult supervision unnoticed, and this gap became the focus of all subsequent analysis. The gap was not long, just minutes, but in the context of a 2-year-old's disappearance, it was enough to open a range of possibilities, from the child wandering out of the familiar range on her own, to the possibility of quick and silent external interference. Investigators noted that no statement described a shocking event strong enough to etch into memory, no screams, no signs of struggle, and this very absence of clear signals made pinpointing the exact moment Margaret vanished more difficult, because human memory tends to retain unusual moments rather than smooth transitions from presence to absence. In the analysis process, some details were flagged as uncertain. For instance, one person believing they saw Margaret in a specific position, while another didn't recall it, or a time frame estimated based on daily routine rather than a clock, and these points were retained as open questions rather than eliminated. Determining the critical moment, the earliest Margaret could have vanished, and the latest she was definitely still there, became the most important outcome of this phase, as it allowed the investigation force to narrow the scope of reasoning and avoid infinitely expanding hypotheses. However, even with a relative timeframe established, investigators still faced the reality that all statements were given after the event, in a high emotional state, and thus could not be seen as absolute data, but only as pieces needing verification in subsequent steps. The statements and initial timeline phase ended with a cautious conclusion that there existed a short but decisive time gap, that there was no direct evidence Margaret left on her own safely, and that all assumptions at this point had to remain open, because any hasty conclusion could send the investigation down the wrong path from the very first steps. From the critical time frame just established through statements and initial cross-checking, the investigative team moved into the crime scene investigation phase with the goal of clarifying one central question: what really happened in that brief gap that left no obvious signs for those present. The area identified as where Margaret was last seen was approached in a controlled manner, prioritizing the preservation of whatever remained after the earlier spontaneous search efforts, though in reality, the scene had already been somewhat disturbed by the initial panic of the family and neighbors. The examination began with the spaces closest to the little girl's daily activities, including areas inside the house, the front yard, the backyard, and all entry and exit points, with every small detail documented to determine if there were any signs that Margaret had suffered an accident or physical impact. Initial results showed no clear signs of violence, no furniture unusually displaced, no blood, no drag marks or signs of struggle, and it was precisely this normalcy of the scene that posed a major challenge for the investigation, because in many missing child cases, the scene usually leaves at least some indication that the event occurred in a state of emergency. Alongside ruling out violence at the site, authorities also assessed the possibility of an accident, examining high-risk areas such as pits, ponds, construction zones, or places that could pose danger to a 2-year-old if she moved on her own. But no evidence was found that Margaret had encountered any incident in the immediate vicinity. The absence of evidence for either accident or violence forced investigators to consider another possibility: that if Margaret had left the area, the process had occurred quickly, silently, and without creating enough disturbance to be remembered, which suggested the likelihood of deliberate external intervention rather than a random sequence of actions by a young child. From that assessment, the examination expanded to surrounding areas, including routes leading out of the residential neighborhood, side paths and points that could be used for approach or departure without drawing attention, with the aim of determining if there were any signs of rapid movement away from the scene. However, the biggest limitation of this phase lay in the characteristics of the area and the timing of the incident, where common surfaces like dirt roads, sandy yards, and grassy areas do not easily retain lasting traces, especially after many people had passed through before the scene was fully secured. Investigators noted that any potential signs, if they had existed, were likely erased by the short but sufficient time that diminished their evidentiary value, and this required them to be cautious in drawing conclusions based on the absence of evidence. Search perimeters were established based on the most conservative assumption that if Margaret had moved on her own, the range would be very limited due to her age and mobility, but if there was an abducting factor, that range could expand rapidly beyond the familiar area in a very short time. This vast difference between the two scenarios made prioritizing directions difficult, as the wrong choice could lead to inefficient allocation of resources in the critical early hours. During the examination, investigators also evaluated the accessibility of the area to outsiders, considering whether this was a space easily infiltrated, and whether the presence of a stranger could occur unnoticed in the context of the neighborhood's daily activities. Factors such as lines of sight, distances between houses, pedestrian traffic density, and common living habits were analyzed to determine the feasibility of each hypothesis. The preliminary conclusion of the crime scene investigation phase did not provide clear answers, but instead confirmed a troubling reality, that the scene did not offer sufficient physical evidence to pinpoint exactly what happened, and that whatever action led to Margaret's disappearance had been carried out in a way that left no easily detectable traces. The limitation of initial evidence became a defining factor for the entire subsequent investigation process, because when the scene revealed nothing, authorities were forced to rely more on logical inference, indirect statements, and the systematic elimination of possibilities, all while facing time pressure and the family's expectation that every step would bring them closer to answers about what happened to Margaret in that brief but decisive period. After the crime scene investigation yielded no sufficiently clear physical signs to determine exactly what occurred in the critical time gap, authorities were compelled to decide to expand the scale of response, shifting from the initial verification phase to a widespread search phase with the assumption that the chance of finding Margaret safe still existed if action was taken quickly and comprehensively enough. The activation of the official search was implemented under emergency protocols for missing child cases, in which local police served as the central coordinator, developing search plans based on the most plausible scenarios drawn from the initial timeline and scene assessment, while dividing the area into specific search grids to avoid overlap and omissions. The initial focus of the operation was placed on the vicinity of where Margaret was last seen, because at age 2, her ability to move independently was limited, and absent external intervention, a reasonable range of movement would not exceed a certain radius within the established time frame. However, alongside that assumption, investigators did not rule out the possibility that Margaret had been quickly taken away by some means, and the simultaneous existence of these two opposing scenarios required the search operation to be designed flexibly enough to adapt to both. To meet the demands for manpower and speed, the local community was mobilized to participate almost immediately, not only due to the number of people needed to cover a large area, but also because in cases like this, local residents often have the advantage of familiarity with the terrain, side paths, overlooked areas, and daily habits that could provide critical context for the search. Neighbors, friends of the Ramirez family, and even those with no direct connection to them joined, forming small search groups assigned to specific areas, under the guidance of authorities, to ensure that any potential discoveries were reported and documented systematically. Community involvement not only increased the scale of the search, but also created an atmosphere of urgency, enveloping the area, where the previous sense of safety was quickly replaced by the realization that a child could vanish in broad daylight, without anyone noticing. In addition to human search efforts, tracking dogs were deployed as a key support tool, with the hope that their scent tracking ability could provide a specific direction in the absence of clear physical evidence. Tracking dog teams were brought to key points, including where Margaret was last seen, and routes likely leading out of the neighborhood, to determine if there were signs that she had moved in a particular direction. However, the fact that the scene had been traversed by many people during the earlier spontaneous search phase, combined with terrain and weather conditions, made the tracking results inconclusive, producing signals not strong enough to confirm a specific path of movement, but also not entirely dismissible. Other support resources, including patrol vehicles, lighting equipment, and communication systems, were used to maintain continuous and coordinated search activity among groups, especially as the operation extended and required tight organization to prevent chaos. As the search range expanded and time passed, local media began to engage, serving both as an information channel and a powerful influence on the pace of the case, as news reports about a missing 2-year-old quickly spread, drawing public attention and generating a wave of responses from people who believed they might have seen something related. Media involvement increased the number of reported leads, from calls providing information about a child resembling Margaret at various locations to observations of vehicles or individuals exhibiting unusual behavior in the area, and each such piece of information had to be received and evaluated within tight time constraints. At this stage, lead collection was both broad and cautious, as while no possibility related to Margaret's safety could be ignored, investigators also faced the risk of being drawn into unsubstantiated directions that could divert resources from higher probability scenarios. Each lead was recorded, categorized, and preliminarily checked, but most could not be immediately verified, creating a chain of hope and disappointment as possibilities were opened and then quickly closed. Throughout the widespread search operation, time pressure was present at every level, from the family waiting in desperation to the authorities, continually deciding whether to further expand the range or focus deeper on a specific direction, all without clear indicators of which choice was correct. The combination of relentless search efforts, widespread community participation, professional support tools, and continuous information flow from the media created a phase of intense but uncertain activity, where every hour passing without concrete results heightened the sense that the operation was racing against an invisible clock, and that despite maximum resource mobilization, the chance of finding Margaret safe was eroding minute by minute. As the widespread search operation entered its next phase, without yielding definitive results, the investigative team's attention gradually converged on the first scattered discoveries that could be considered physical evidence directly related to Margaret's disappearance, because in the context of lacking reliable witnesses and clear signs of violence, any item connected to the little girl's daily life had the potential to provide clues about her direction of movement or the manner in which she left the area. These items did not appear immediately at the initial scene, but were found during expanded sweeps, as search groups and authorities began more thoroughly checking areas previously deemed unrelated, from roadside edges and vacant lots, to spaces overlooked because they were not in the priority range. The discovery of items related to the victim triggered an immediate response in the investigative team, as they both confirmed that Margaret had been present at a specific point after the time established in the initial timeline, and raised questions about whether the items were left randomly or as the result of deliberate action. Each piece of evidence was handled with careful protocol, documenting position, condition, and connection to Margaret's daily routine, to avoid assigning meaning beyond their actual value, a common risk in cases where pressure to find answers can lead investigators to see connections where none exist. The investigative value of the evidence was assessed not only based on the item itself, but also on the context of discovery, the timing of the find, and the distance from where Margaret was last seen, as only the combination of these factors could help determine whether the evidence reflected a step in the victim's movement, or was merely part of the familiar living environment. In the analysis process, several initial hypotheses were weighed, including the possibility that Margaret carried or dropped the items while moving on her own, that the evidence was left behind during someone else's removal of her, or that the items were not directly related to the disappearance, but coincidentally matched in time and space. Eliminating or strengthening these hypotheses required investigators to cross-reference the evidence with prior statements and the established timeline, checking whether the item's appearance aligned with identified time markers, and whether there were logical gaps that the evidence could fill. Some hypotheses quickly weakened when the evidence could not explain how Margaret could have reached the location independently within the circumscribed time frame, while others were strengthened by the reality that the item's appearance at a certain point could only occur with rapid movement exceeding a 2-year-old's capability. It was at this juncture that the investigation direction began to shift significantly, as authorities were compelled to seriously consider the possibility that Margaret had not simply wandered off or met with an accident, but had been removed from the area by an external factor, though the exact method remained undetermined. This shift led to changes in search scope and methods, from primarily focusing on areas near the scene, to examining routes that could be used to quickly exit the neighborhood, as well as re-evaluating prior sighting reports in light of new information from the evidence. However, the very uncertainty about the meaning of the discovered items posed a major challenge, as each directional adjustment carried the risk of pushing the investigation further from reality, if the underlying assumption was incorrect. And with limited resources, every decision had to be weighed between potential success and the cost of a wrong choice. Investigative pressure intensified markedly as the evidence, rather than providing definitive answers, raised more questions, leaving the Ramirez family both hopeful and fearful that each new discovery might indicate Margaret had gone farther than imagined, or worse, that she had fallen into an irretrievable situation. For the investigators, this pressure came not only from the family and community, but also from the awareness that time was diminishing the value of every clue, as prolongation made verifying hypotheses based on evidence increasingly difficult. The adjustment of investigation direction in this phase was not a single decision, but a continuous process, where each new piece of evidence was placed into the overall picture and required re-evaluation with additional information, creating a loop of collection, analysis, and adjustment without a clear endpoint. In that context, the rising investigative pressure became tangible, manifested in work intensity, extended operating hours, and the sense that any small error could lead to major consequences, because if the existing evidence was not interpreted correctly, the search risked veering off course at a moment when the opportunity for success still existed. The physical evidence and investigation direction adjustment phase concluded not with a firm conclusion, but with a shared recognition that the case was more complex than initially envisioned, that Margaret's disappearance might not fit simple scenarios, and that every subsequent step would have to be taken in a state of both urgency and caution, as each decision carried the heavy responsibility of whether it would bring the investigation closer to the truth. From the moment the scattered pieces of evidence forced the investigation to constantly adjust its direction, an almost unavoidable consequence began to emerge: the explosion of unverified leads, information coming from outside the crime scene that carried hope, but lacked any basis for verification, gradually pulling the investigation into a state of dispersion and resource depletion. The first sighting reports appeared in a context where the community had been widely mobilized, and local media was continuously covering the story, causing any image resembling a 2-year-old child to potentially become the center of attention, from a little girl walking with an adult in a shopping area, to a child playing near a gas station or park far from the original scene. Each sighting received was accompanied by a sense of urgency, because if even one of them was real, it could completely change the direction of the search, but reality quickly showed that the vast majority of these reports could not be verified. Either because the descriptions were too vague, the timing did not match the established timeline, or the geographical distance exceeded reasonable travel capability within the identified time frame. Alongside the sightings, anonymous calls and rumors began to appear, some from people who believed they held important information, but were unwilling to provide their identity, others speculative, or even exaggerated, reflecting the widespread anxiety in the community more than any investigative value. Authorities were forced to receive and document all this information, not because they believed it all had value, but because in child disappearance cases, overlooking even the smallest lead could lead to irreversible consequences, and it was precisely this cautious approach that caused the workload to increase rapidly, while actual effectiveness gradually declined. When unverified leads were entered into the evaluation system, investigators had to spend time classifying, verifying, and eliminating them, a process that consumed considerable resources without producing commensurate progress, and gradually blurred the boundary between investigative directions with solid basis and those based more on hope than evidence. In this context, some initial hypotheses began to be pursued more deeply than necessary, not because they were strengthened by new evidence, but because they were the rare remaining directions in a picture that was increasingly lacking solid anchors, and the prolongation of these weak hypotheses put the investigation at risk of falling into a loop of checking and eliminating, without getting closer to the truth. The investigation going off track did not happen as a sudden turn, but as a gradual slide, when each small decision was made in a high-pressure context with incomplete information, causing resources to be allocated to approaches that became increasingly ineffective. Search teams were deployed to farther areas based on vague sightings. Investigators had to pursue unverifiable calls, and each time this happened, it reduced the ability to focus on the core elements of the case, particularly the initial anomalies at the scene, and the key timeline established in the first hours. The depletion of resources became evident, not only in the number of man-hours and personnel used, but also in the mental fatigue of those involved, as each new effort ended by returning to the starting point, without any specific answers about Margaret's location or condition. Meanwhile, the Ramirez family had to face a series of hopes and disappointments in succession, each new piece of information conveyed with caution, but still carrying the possibility that this could be the final lead to finding the little girl, only to be quickly dismissed when it could not be verified, creating a prolonged state of stress that eroded their resilience. For the investigative forces, the pressure came not only from the family and community, but also from internal requirements that a child disappearance case could not drag on without progress, and this pressure sometimes led to decisions being made with the desire to create movement, rather than based on a cold assessment of evidentiary value. Throughout this period, a common standout point was the inability to identify any specific suspect, as no testimony was solid enough to point to a suspicious individual, no physical evidence directly linked to a specific person, and no clear behavioral pattern matching previously recorded similar cases. Each hypothesis about the possible involvement of an individual or group quickly reached a dead end when it could not be supported by independent data, and the absence of a suspect caused the investigation to lose an important pivot, forcing investigators to continue working in a state of groping among vague possibilities. This early stalemate was not the result of lack of effort, but the consequence of a set of adverse conditions, including a scene poor in evidence, inconsistent testimonies due to stress, and an information environment disrupted by too many false signals. As the phase of false leads dragged on, the investigation began to lose its initial sharpness, shifting from a highly focused emergency response to a series of dispersed activities aimed at addressing every possibility no matter how small, and it was this shift that marked the point when the hope of finding Margaret quickly began to be replaced by the realization that the case might be far more complex and prolonged than anyone had imagined in the first hours after she disappeared. The stalemate formed from the accumulation of false leads, dispersed investigative directions, and the inability to identify a specific suspect, gradually forced authorities to confront an unavoidable question: whether maintaining the search and investigation at emergency intensity still provided real value in a context where no new data emerged that could change the situation. Internal meetings took place with decreasing frequency, not due to indifference, but because all available information had been reviewed multiple times from different angles without producing a breakthrough, making continued expansion of field searches more formal than strategic. Areas that had been thoroughly searched were marked as completed. Resources that had been mobilized at the highest level began to be reassigned to other equally urgent cases with more potential for progress, and from there, the decision to end the official search formed as a logical consequence of the prolonged evaluation process, rather than an abrupt cutoff. Ending wide-area search activities did not mean all investigative efforts stopped immediately, but it marked a fundamental change in the approach to the case, when priority shifted from rapid response to maintaining the file in a state of waiting for new information. The investigation no longer progressed in the traditional sense of expanding directions or tracing leads, but moved to a phase of reviewing, archiving, and preserving what had been collected, in the hope that in the future, some external factor might revive data that seemed exhausted of value. The case file was resystematized, reports standardized, testimonies arranged in logical order, and the entire case classified as unsolved, an administrative status reflecting the reality that there was not enough evidence to reach a final conclusion, but also no basis to close the file. This labeling led to a clear change in priority level, as Margaret's disappearance was no longer viewed as an ongoing situation, but became a case existing in the system, ready to be reactivated if new information appeared, but no longer occupying a central position in the daily resource allocation of the investigative forces. The deprioritization was not publicly announced in an obvious way, but it showed through small details, such as the assigned investigators being given additional tasks, updates to the family no longer occurring frequently, and scene reviews becoming periodic rather than continuous. For the system, this was a necessary transition to maintain overall efficiency, but for the Ramirez family, it carried the meaning of prolonged silence, an information void, where all questions remained but no one could provide new answers. The family continued waiting in an unclear state, between faint hope that the case had not been forgotten, and fear that public and official attention was gradually fading, leaving them alone with repetitive thoughts about what happened, and what might have been done differently. This waiting had no specific form, no deadline, and no sign of when it would end, because a cold case file does not come with a promise of future resolution, but only an acknowledgement that in the present, the system had reached its limit. Meanwhile, the community that had once been bustling with search activities and constant information gradually returned to daily life. Margaret's disappearance shifting from the center of conversations to a lingering memory occasionally mentioned, each time rekindling unease about the fragility of the sense of safety once taken for granted. For the investigative forces, classifying the case as unsolved did not bring relief, but left a feeling of incompleteness, as there was no suspect to prosecute, no answer to close it, only a thick file full of efforts, hypotheses, and decisions made under conditions of incomplete information. The Ramirez family had to adapt to this new reality, where life continued while the question of Margaret's fate remained unresolved, neither answered nor disappearing, becoming an inseparable part of daily life, where each silence from the investigation deepened the feeling that the case had entered a different phase, no longer a race against time, but a prolonged wait without a known end. While Margaret Ramirez's file gradually receded into the prolonged silence of an unsolved case, the little girl's life did not stop at the moment of disappearance, but continued in a completely different space, absolutely separated from her biological family and the context where she had existed in her first 2 years. Margaret grew up in a different location, bearing no clear traces of the initial disruption, because at such a young age for forming lasting memories, the change in living environment was not registered as an event, but simply became the only starting point she could perceive about herself. She was called by a different name, lived in a different family, in a different community, where all relationships, habits, and experiences were built on the foundation of a new legal identity, legitimizing her existence in the social system, without revealing any connection to her previous life. This legal identity was used in every aspect of life, from identification documents, medical records, to school and social relationships, creating a consistent reality, to the point that there was no reason for a child growing up in it to doubt her origins. The caregiving conditions and living environment Margaret experienced in the following years appeared stable on the surface, sufficient to meet the basic needs of a growing child, but provided no clues about the existence of a biological family elsewhere, still waiting without knowing her fate. Those around her, whether direct caregivers or extended social relationships, all accepted Margaret as an individual with a clear starting point, according to what the documents showed, and this consistency left no room for the story of a past disappearance in her daily life. Throughout her upbringing, Margaret was not provided with any information suggesting she had ever had a different life, no stories about conflicting birth dates, no details inadvertently revealed, and no signs for her to suspect that the identity she carried was not her original one. Not knowing about the disappearance was not the result of a conscious decision on her part, but the natural consequence of the entire surrounding environment, reinforcing the same story about her origins and presence, causing any potential questions, if they ever arose, to be quickly eliminated by that consistency. However, even without memories or specific information about her biological family, an invisible gap still existed between Margaret and what should have belonged to her, a gap that could not be named when she was young, but gradually became perceptible through life experiences without clear explanation. This gap did not manifest as a specific pain, but as a vague feeling of incompleteness, of missing something indefinable, a feeling often overshadowed by daily life, but sometimes emerging in moments of silence, or when facing questions about origins, family, and belonging. Margaret's new living environment provided her with different relationship patterns, different values, and different understandings of the concept of family, making the bond with her biological family, though existing biologically, have no opportunity to form experientially. While the Ramirez family continued living with the memory of a 2-year-old child who disappeared, Margaret grew up without knowing that elsewhere, there were people who still called her name in their thoughts, still holding on to brief memories of her as an inseparable part of the life they once had. This separation was not just geographical or informational, but a separation in time and experience, as each passing year increased the distance between two parallel realities, one a continuing life with a new identity, the other a prolonged wait, with an unupdatable memory. Margaret matured in her environment with its own challenges and opportunities, going through stages of childhood, adolescence, and the early steps of adulthood, without any signs indicating the existence of another story running parallel outside her awareness. Not knowing about the disappearance did not protect her from all psychological impacts of the initial rupture, because even without direct memories, the profound environmental changes in the early years could still leave hard-to-identify marks, manifesting as feelings of displacement without clear cause or questions about herself, not easily answered. However, in a context without contrasting information, those feelings were not linked to any specific past event, but simply seen as part of growing up, explained by other common causes. The distance between Margaret and her biological family was thus not just spatial or temporal, but perceptual, as both sides existed in completely different realities, with no intersection, no common information channel, and no way to recognize each other's existence beyond memories and files that had been closed. Margaret's life continued in that separation, built on new relationships and experiences, while the story of her disappearance remained as an unfilled void in the lives of those who lost her, creating two parallel life paths, each complete in its own way, but both missing an important part that neither side could recognize for a long period of time. Life built on a new identity gave Margaret an outward sense of stability, but as she grew older, her childhood experiences began to reveal mismatches that she herself lacked the language or frame of reference to name. These did not manifest as a clear event, but accumulated gradually through small details, seemingly unimportant moments in everyday life, where the story about herself did not fully align with her inner perceptions. Margaret grew up in a family where relationships were predefined, where her role had been placed in a specific position, but it was within those familiar patterns that she sometimes noticed an inexplicable difference between herself and those around her, a difference that could not be attributed simply to personality or living circumstances. Her childhood experiences were not lacking in material terms, but they carried moments of emotional emptiness when the natural questions of a young child about origins, about similarities and differences among family members, did not receive complete or consistent answers. Information about Margaret's origins existed as a collection of fragmented stories, recounted in a way that was enough to satisfy momentary curiosity, but not enough to create a clear picture, and it was this very ambiguity that led her to gradually form the habit of not asking too many questions, as a way of adapting to the reality she was living in. The contradictions in the family story did not always surface, but when they did, it was usually on occasions requiring specific information, such as filling out paperwork, answering simple questions about date of birth, place of birth, or the context of her early years, and each time, Margaret sensed a hesitation or shift in how the information was presented. These details, when taken individually, were not enough to cause major doubt, but as they accumulated over time, they formed an unstable foundation, where the story about herself did not fully match her own intuitive feelings. The sense of alienation began to form not because Margaret was treated differently, but because she could not find a solid anchor for the question of who she was and where she came from. A question often set aside in the early years, but becoming clearer as she entered a phase of deeper self-awareness. In the school environment and expanding social relationships, Margaret noticed that she reacted differently to stories about family, about blood ties, about shared childhood memories, as if she were standing outside a common experience that everyone else took for granted. These reactions were not strong enough to become an issue, but enough to create a quiet sense of separation, an awareness that something in her own story did not fully align with the norms around her. Early signs of inconsistency did not appear in the form of dramatic events, but seeped in through the way Margaret remembered her own childhood, where gaps in information could not be filled by memories or accounts, and where important milestones in her personal life seemed to lack a clear foundation to hold on to. She had memories, but they were memories that started later than what others typically recounted about their early childhood, and the absence of very early memories was not explained convincingly, only seen as normal without anyone delving deeper. In rare moments of self-questioning, Margaret sensed a discrepancy between the story she had been told and her inner feelings, but since there was no evidence or alternative information, that discrepancy was gradually accepted by her as an unchangeable part of herself. Margaret's childhood thus passed in a state that was both normal and abnormal, where all external factors indicated a stable life, but inside there existed unanswered questions, mismatched pieces that she could not fit together into a complete picture. It was these early signs of inconsistency, though faint and easily overlooked, that laid the foundation for a prolonged process of realization, where Margaret learned to live with a sense of alienation without fully understanding its origin, a feeling not strong enough to disrupt her current life, but enough to quietly shape how she viewed herself and her relationships with the world around her. The sense of discrepancy formed in the early years did not disappear as Margaret grew up. On the contrary, it was gradually reinforced by more concrete encounters with administrative and social systems, where personal identity exists, not only in inner perception, but is also confirmed by documents, records, and official data. The first signs of legal inconsistency appeared in situations that seemed utterly ordinary. When Margaret needed to use her birth certificate for basic administrative procedures, and realized that this document did not provide the sense of certainty it should have, not because it was completely lacking information, but because the details in it seemed not to connect tightly with the story she had heard about her early years. The date of birth, place of birth, and related information were presented validly on paper, but lacked the specific elements that typically appear in family stories, making the birth certificate a legitimate legal artifact, but one that did not create a feeling of personal authenticity. When comparing the birth certificate with other family documents, Margaret began to notice that there was little supporting information accompanying it. No photos, no detailed stories about the day she was born, and no natural link between the legal document and the memories shared in the family. Margaret's medical records also bore similar characteristics, as information about the newborn period and early years was incomplete or recorded sporadically, lacking the continuity typically seen in the records of a child raised in the same environment from birth. Doctors and medical facilities recorded her health status from a certain point onward, but earlier data was not stored or did not exist, creating a gap that no one could explain clearly. These gaps, when considered individually, could be attributed to various reasons, but when placed alongside the birth certificate and the family story, they began to form a pattern of inconsistency that was hard to ignore. School records further reinforced this feeling, as during her schooling, Margaret had to provide personal information for various forms multiple times, and each time she noticed a lack of synchronization between documents, from the name of the guardian, residential address in the early years, to information related to school transfers or initial registration. Some data was filled in based on memory or guesswork rather than original records, creating small but recurring discrepancies, enough to make Margaret realize that the legal story of her life was not built on a unified foundation. The lack of family connection further highlighted these inconsistencies, as while the social relationships around Margaret were all based on clear ties of blood or shared history, her connection to those considered family lacked specific anchors in the past. There were no stories retold multiple times, no collective memories shared from very early on, and no physical evidence like photos or family documents that could reinforce a sense of belonging, all of which led Margaret to gradually become aware that her link to her current family was more functional than historical. Doubts about her origins did not arise suddenly, but were formed through the accumulation of small details, as Margaret began to question not only why some information was missing, but also why no one seemed willing or able to provide satisfactory explanations for those gaps. Each time she tried to piece together the legal and personal fragments, the result was an incomplete picture, where official documents confirmed her existence in the system, but could not tell a coherent story about how she had begun her life. This inconsistency not only caused personal confusion, but also placed Margaret in a prolonged state of hesitation, as she had to choose between accepting the current story as a truth that needed no further verification, or facing the possibility that the identity she carried might not fully reflect her true origins. Questioning her origins thus became a quiet process, not widely shared, not expressed outwardly, but increasingly central to how Margaret viewed herself and her history. Legal documents, designed to provide certainty and stability, instead became a source of doubt, as they existed, but could not connect to lived experiences and personal memories. In that context, Margaret had no concrete evidence to affirm that something was wrong, but she also could no longer ignore the recurring signs that the legal story of her life was built on an incomplete foundation. Inconsistent legal identity was thus not just an administrative issue, but became a core question about herself, about truth, and about the connection between what is recorded on paper and what is felt in real life, a question still unanswered, but increasingly hard to avoid, as Margaret continued on the path of discovering who she really was, and where she had begun this life. The legal inconsistencies and information gaps did not remain at the level of paperwork, but gradually seeped into Margaret's inner life in ways that were hard to detect, and even harder to name, manifesting as subtle psychological signs, not clear enough to be considered abnormal, but recurring enough to form a pattern of behavior and emotion that was distinct. In daily activities, Margaret did not exhibit extreme actions or markedly deviant expressions, but the way she reacted to situations involving family, origins, and personal bonds often carried a more reserved tone than others, as if she always maintained a certain distance between herself and stories considered obvious. This behavior was not intentional alienation, but a form of self-regulation, where Margaret learned to observe more than participate, listen more than share, and avoid placing herself in situations requiring overly clear assertions about herself. Her emotional responses in those contexts also had a subtle instability, not manifesting as outbursts or breakdowns, but showing through slight yet consistent shifts, when seemingly harmless questions or comments could cause her to fall into prolonged quietness or unexplained discomfort. These responses were often seen by others as personal sensitivity or character traits, But for Margaret herself, they were signs that something was touching a deeper layer she could not yet access through reason. Difficulty in self-identification became clearer as Margaret entered life stages requiring choices and self-definition, where questions about who she was, where she belonged, and what had shaped her could no longer be postponed. Unlike those who could rely on family stories and personal history to build a sense of continuity about themselves, Margaret realized that those anchors were not solid for her, making self-identification a process full of hesitation and lacking confidence. She could describe herself by current roles and existing relationships, but when trying to trace back to origins, the story became vague, with no clear thread connecting the distant past to the present. This very discontinuity gave rise to lingering questions about identity, questions that did not surge all at once, but returned cyclically, each time a bit stronger as Margaret faced life milestones or situations evoking concepts of blood ties and family history. She began to wonder not only about the accuracy of the information she had, but also why those questions had never been answered satisfactorily, and whether the silence around them was the result of ignorance or something concealed. These thoughts did not immediately lead to action, as Margaret was still held back by the need to maintain stability in her current life, but they created an undercurrent in her mind, where every new detail received was placed in a broader context of doubt and search for meaning. The motivation to uncover the truth thus did not stem from a specific event or shocking discovery, but from the accumulation of small yet persistent psychological signs, as Margaret gradually realized that continuing to ignore questions about identity was consuming more emotional energy than facing them. She did not seek the truth as an act of rebellion or denial of the known past, but as an effort to clarify the nameless feelings that had followed her for so long, in the hope that understanding her origins could bring a greater sense of continuity about herself. These subtle psychological signs did not cause Margaret to detach from social life or lose her ability to adapt, but they quietly shaped how she approached the world, making her more cautious in forming bonds and more sensitive to stories of belonging. In that context, the motivation to uncover the truth was not a spontaneous decision, but the result of a prolonged inner process where unusual behaviors, unstable emotional responses, difficulties in self-identification, and unanswered questions gradually converged, forming a need that could no longer be postponed. The undercurrent of lingering questions finally reached a point where Margaret could no longer brush them aside, when an event that seemed ordinary in everyday life directly touched the long-accumulated voids and made the need to understand her origins more urgent than ever. The event was not dramatic or tragic, but specific enough to force Margaret to confront the reality that the answers she had been avoiding had now become essential for moving forward steadily, and that not knowing where she came from was creating an invisible drag on her ability to fully understand herself. From that moment, seeking information was no longer a vague thought, but a purposeful action, approached by Margaret cautiously and independently, without relying on familiar stories or existing explanations, starting instead with reviewing what she truly knew and what was still missing. She gathered personal documents, re-examined legal papers, cross-checked details that had been overlooked, and tried to determine if any clues existed that could lead to a clearer understanding of her origins, though at this stage, her efforts were primarily about ruling things out, rather than discovering new information. The process of searching for information independently took place in silence, not widely shared, because Margaret was fully aware that questioning her origins could disrupt current relationships and provoke reactions she was not yet ready to face, and so she chose a personal step-by-step approach to control the pace and scope of what might be uncovered. In this process, she gradually realized that traditional documents provided no new information, and that the largest gaps could not be filled by continuing to search within the same system that had created them, a realization that led her to consider alternative ways to access the truth. The idea of DNA testing emerged in that context, not as a certain solution, but as a new possibility, opened up in an era where technology allows individuals to access information once held only by large institutions. Approaching DNA testing was not seen by Margaret as a decisive action from the start, but as an experimental step, a way to gather additional objective data while keeping expectations low to avoid disappointment if the results did not provide clear answers. She approached this option realistically, understanding that DNA could provide information about biological origins but would not necessarily explain her entire life story, and that any results needed to be placed in the broader context of personal experience and legal history. Her initially low expectations were not due to a lack of faith in the technology, but because she was aware that the truth, if it existed, could be far more complex and harder to accept than she imagined, and that preparing mentally for all possibilities was necessary to avoid rushing into hasty assumptions. However, the very decision to pursue DNA testing, even made with caution, marked a significant turning point in her journey to understand her origins, because for the first time, Margaret was proactively seeking an answer independent of retold stories or documents that might be incomplete or inaccurate. This shift was not just technical but psychologically profound, as Margaret accepted that facing the truth, whatever it might be, could be the only way to resolve the feelings of unease that had followed her for years. The decision was not made impulsively or in rebellion, but as the result of a long deliberation, where the need to understand herself finally outweighed the fear of what might be exposed. In that context, investigating her origins was no longer simply a search for answers, but became an essential part of the process of self-definition, where Margaret began to accept that the truth, though unknown, could be the key to connecting the scattered pieces of her life into a more coherent story, even if that story turned out to be far different from what she had been led to believe. The decision to pursue DNA testing, though made with initially low expectations, set off a chain of reactions that Margaret could not fully control, as her biological data was entered into a system far larger than anything she had imagined. The results did not appear as a direct answer or a clear identity, but began with the emergence of distant relative matches, people with enough genetic similarity to confirm a biological connection, but not close enough to immediately draw a complete family tree. These matches, initially just numbers and percentages, gradually became important reference points as Margaret began to realize they were not randomly distributed, but clustered around certain surnames and regions. Identifying the relevant geographic areas became the next logical step, as genealogical DNA data allowed tracing relative branches back to regions where common ancestors had lived, and in Margaret's case, the results began converging on an area with which she had no personal or historical connection, based on what she knew about herself. That convergence was not enough to draw a conclusion, but enough to raise a critical question about why her biological data was tied to a geographic region completely foreign to the life story she had been told. To avoid hasty speculation, Margaret approached the analysis cautiously, ruling out incompatible possibilities by cross-referencing each match with available information, considering ages, expected relationships, and other factors that could explain the overlap without needing a complicated scenario. Some possibilities were quickly eliminated when they could not be reconciled with her life's timeline or existing legal data, while others, fewer in number, held up after initial screening, creating a small set of connections with potential to explain her biological origins. It was during this process that a new suspicion began to form, no longer centered on whether Margaret was the biological child of her current family, but expanding to the possibility that her biological identity might be linked to a larger event, a story not just personal but recorded in systems beyond the family scope. When the DNA data was placed alongside public information about unsolved missing persons cases, some similarities began to emerge in a way that could not be easily dismissed, though not yet enough to confirm a direct link. These similarities did not appear as clear evidence, but as faint outlines in a larger picture, where pieces seemed to start fitting together in a logic that had not existed before. The suspicion of a connection to a cold case was not accepted by Margaret as a conclusion, but as a possibility requiring thorough verification, because she was fully aware that linking genealogical DNA results to an unsolved case carried serious consequences, not only for herself, but for those who might have been waiting years for answers. Nevertheless, the emergence of this suspicion completely changed the context of her journey to understand her origins, as the question shifted from where she came from to how she had entered this life, and whether the absence of information in the past was the result of a recorded but unresolved incident. The investigative turning point formed not from a single discovery, but from the convergence of many small factors, as genealogical DNA data, geographic analysis, and the elimination of common possibilities together created a new direction that Margaret could no longer ignore. This direction did not provide immediate answers, but it gave her something she had never had before, a specific path to continue searching, a way to move from vague doubt to a structured process where each step could be verified and cross-checked. In that context, the genealogical DNA results were no longer a static set of data, but a dynamic tool, opening the possibility of connecting Margaret's personal story to a broader history, where what had been seen as gaps in identity might now be traces of an overlooked event, an event whose proper identification could change not only how Margaret understood herself, but how an unresolved story was reconsidered from the beginning. The new approach formed from the genealogical DNA results did not remain within Margaret's personal scope, but quickly extended beyond when that data was forwarded to appropriate channels for evaluation from an official investigative perspective, where possibilities once considered too vague began to be taken seriously. The cold case unit received the case in a context where the file on Margaret Ramirez had existed for years as a closed set of documents, stored with full reports, statements, and provisional conclusions, but lacking the decisive element to advance the investigation further. This reception was not automatic or emotional, but based on the assessment that genealogical DNA data provided a type of information that did not exist at the time of the original investigation, sufficient to justify re-examining the entire file through a new lens. The cold case unit investigators began by reviewing all old documents, not to look for errors in prior efforts, but to understand the context, limitations, and assumptions that shaped the initial investigation, thereby determining how the new data might interact with what was already known. The process of cross-referencing DNA data with the old file occurred in layers, as information about distant relative matches was placed alongside details about the geographic area, timing, and circumstances of Margaret's disappearance, to determine if there were intersection points strong enough to exceed the threshold of suspicion. Details once deemed unimportant in the absence of physical evidence, such as the initial search radius, dismissed sighting reports, or gaps in the timeline, were now brought back for analysis to see if they aligned with the genetic patterns and geographic distribution suggested by the DNA data. In this process, some matching points began to be identified, not as direct evidence, but as logical connections between biological data and case elements, as the geographic area appearing in the genealogical DNA results overlapped with where the disappearance occurred, and as Margaret's biological timeline matched the profile of a child reported missing but never confirmed deceased. These matching points were not enough to draw a conclusion, but they were sufficient to change how the case was viewed, from one lacking leads to one potentially explainable with modern investigative tools. Identifying these matching points led to reprioritizing the case within the cold case unit, not in the sense of placing it above all others, but in allocating appropriate resources to seriously test the possibility that Margaret's biological identity might be tied to the missing persons file that had existed in the system for decades. This prioritization was reflected in assigning dedicated investigators, establishing a data analysis team, and dedicating time to rebuilding the case story from scratch, this time with the assumption that Margaret might still be alive, and that her disappearance could be explained by a scenario different from those previously considered. Developing a new investigative plan became the next strategic step, as the cold case unit determined that reopening the file could not rely solely on repeating old steps, but must integrate genealogical DNA data with modern investigative methods, including digital data analysis, reviewing civil records, and re-evaluating old statements in light of the new information. This plan was built with a high degree of caution to avoid creating unrealistic expectations for the family and community, while ensuring every step had clear legal and scientific basis. In that context, reopening the cold case was not seen as a dramatic event, but as a controlled process, where each decision had to balance the potential for progress with responsibility toward those who had waited years for answers. The biggest change did not lie in adding a specific new clue, but in shifting the investigative mindset, as the central question was no longer what happened to Margaret, but how Margaret had lived her life since disappearing, and whether traces of that life could be traced back to the time of the disappearance. Developing the new investigative plan was thus open-ended, accepting that the final answer might be more complex than a simple scenario, but also acknowledging that with current tools, the limitations that once froze the case were no longer absolute. In that space, the Margaret Ramirez file was pulled from dormancy, not as a firm promise of resolution, but as a commitment that the new data would be pursued thoroughly, with the goal of clarifying whether the overlap between genealogical DNA and the missing persons file was coincidence, or the sign of a truth buried too long to be properly recognized for what it was. Reopening the case with a new investigative plan was not merely a continuation of what had been left unfinished, but a complete restructuring of the entire approach to the case in a context where technology, investigative thinking, and data processing capabilities had fundamentally changed compared to decades earlier. The focus of this phase lay in connecting the past with the present, where every detail once considered vague or insufficiently valuable was now placed into a broader analytical system capable of detecting connections that could not previously be identified. Re-interviewing old witnesses became a necessary but challenging step, as time had altered both memories and the way people interpreted what they had experienced. Investigators approached witnesses with extreme caution, not seeking dramatic confessions or revelations, but focusing on clarifying context, emotions, and details that had been overlooked or not emphasized during the initial investigation. Many witnesses, when questioned again, were no longer under the urgent pressure of the past, allowing them to reflect more deeply on moments that seemed ordinary at the time but could now hold different meaning when placed alongside new data. Timelines were recounted with relatively greater accuracy, not because memories had improved, but because witnesses now understood the importance of every detail, no matter how small, in piecing together the overall picture. Alongside re-interviewing, the case's initial hypotheses were systematically and unbiasedly reassessed to determine what assumptions they had been built on and how those assumptions had been limited by the technology and understanding of the time. Hypotheses previously discarded due to lack of physical evidence or incompatibility with traditional investigative models were re-examined in light of new advancements, not to affirm they were correct, but to ensure they had not been eliminated solely due to lack of verification tools at the time. This reassessment helped clarify the boundary between truly implausible hypotheses and those shelved due to objective limitations, thereby opening up more flexible yet logically rigorous approaches. The application of modern technology played a key role in transforming disparate data into analyzable models, as the cold case unit utilized interconnected database systems to re-examine civil records, residency records, medical records, and any legal identity changes that might have occurred over the years. These tools enabled investigators to perform cross-checks that were previously nearly impossible, such as comparing genealogical DNA data with geographic datasets, identifying plausible travel routes within specific time periods, and detecting anomalies in personal histories that could align with a scenario of a missing child being raised under a different identity. Technology also helped standardize old data, eliminating errors from manual entry or inconsistent past storage methods, thereby increasing the reliability of new analyses. As these data were integrated, the scope of suspicion began to narrow naturally, not by imposing a central hypothesis from the outset, but by gradually eliminating possibilities incompatible with the entire current dataset. Scenarios once considered plausible in the early stages of the investigation, but incompatible with new genetic, geographic, or administrative models were removed from priority, significantly reducing the dispersion that had weakened previous efforts. This narrowing process also highlighted factors previously overlooked, such as travel routes feasible, given the capabilities and conditions of the time, indirect social connections possibly existing beyond the family circle, and administrative gaps that could allow an identity change to occur undetected. Determining the primary investigative direction became the result of this convergence, not as a rigid conclusion, but as an analytical axis guiding all subsequent activities, ensuring resources were used in a focused and purposeful manner. This direction was built on the premise that Margaret might have lived a full life under a different identity, and that traces of that life, however faint, still existed in data systems if searched correctly. Establishing this common direction helped the cold case unit avoid repeating the pattern of reacting to individual leads, instead maintaining a consistent strategy where each new piece of information was evaluated based on its contribution to the overall picture. Throughout the modern investigation phase, the core difference from previous efforts lay in how the team managed uncertainty, no longer viewing it as a sign of failure or deadlock, but as an inevitable part of seeking truth in decades-old cases. Rather than trying to fill every gap with speculation, they accepted leaving some questions open while continuing to gather and verify data, aiming to gradually reduce uncertainty over time. This approach allowed the investigation to progress slowly but steadily, avoiding hasty turns that had derailed the case in the past. The combination of re-interviewing old witnesses, reassessing initial hypotheses, applying modern technology, and gradually narrowing the scope of suspicion created a robust analytical foundation to support subsequent decisions, even if it had not yet yielded a final answer. However, unlike previous phases, this time the investigation was guided by a clearer objective, not just uncovering what happened in the moment Margaret disappeared, but understanding the entire life journey she might have undergone since then. This shift in objective, from pursuing a single event to reconstructing a story spanning many years, made the modern investigation a process both complex and profound, where every discovery, no matter how small, could play a crucial role in connecting past and present. In this context, determining the primary investigative direction did not mark the end of this phase, but the necessary foundation to ensure subsequent steps were taken along a consistent logical axis, where patience, precision, and the ability to leverage modern technology together created a real opportunity to shed light on a case once considered unsolvable. The investigative direction narrowed and clearly defined in the previous phase created the conditions for the identity confirmation step to be implemented as a rigorous verification process where every assumption had to be transformed into irrefutable evidence. Direct-line DNA comparison became the pillar of this phase, as although genealogical data had suggested a strong biological connection, only direct-line testing could provide a decisive conclusion. The comparison process was designed with multiple layers to eliminate any possibility of error, from collecting DNA samples under forensic standards, maintaining chain of custody, to conducting independent analyses at different laboratories to ensure result consistency. The DNA samples were compared not based on a single marker, but on the full set of genetic markers necessary for absolute kinship determination, and the results showed a match far exceeding the confirmation threshold, sufficient to completely rule out random coincidence or biological error. This match not only confirmed the blood relationship, but also aligned precisely with the family structure recorded in the original missing person file, creating a clear link between current biological data and the decades-old case. Alongside DNA verification, legal records underwent comprehensive review, as an investigative conclusion is only considered complete when it stands firm both scientifically and legally. Investigators cross-checked birth certificates, residency records, medical records, and other administrative documents related to the identity Margaret had used throughout her life, aiming to determine how this identity was formed, maintained, and recognized within the system. This review process was not just to detect irregularities, but to understand the chain of legal events that allowed a missing child to exist legally under a different identity for so long, thereby ensuring the victim identity confirmation faced no administrative contradictions that could weaken the investigative conclusion. Timelines in legal records were placed alongside biological and disappearance timelines, showing significant alignment between the emergence of the new identity and Margaret's disappearance, while ruling out confusion with other individuals with similar information. As the two data streams, biological and legal, were merged and cross-verified, a seamless picture began to form, with no major gaps explainable by randomness or isolated error. Victim identity confirmation thus shifted from a reasonable possibility to a certain conclusion, determining that Margaret Ramirez, the 2-year-old who disappeared in 1975, was the adult discovered under a different identity through modern investigation. This conclusion was reached after multiple internal reviews, where independent investigators re-examined the entire process, from sample collection, data analysis, to record comparison, to ensure no vulnerabilities existed that could be questioned later. Completing the investigative conclusion at this phase held special significance, as it ended the prolonged uncertainty about whether the victim was alive, while shifting the case's focus from seeking truth to addressing the consequences of that truth. For the cold case unit, this was not the moment to close the file, but when responsibility grew heavier, as every subsequent decision had to consider direct impact on the people drawn into the case from various angles. Before any information was released or shared externally, notification preparation was conducted as an indispensable step, reflecting the understanding that identity confirmation was not just an investigative outcome, but a potentially shattering event for those involved. Investigators coordinated with legal advisors to determine notification obligations, the scope of shareable information, and the sequence of actions, while working with psychological support experts to anticipate and mitigate possible emotional impacts. This preparation included assessing the psychological state of Margaret, the biological family, and those who raised her, to ensure the truth was presented in a controlled context, avoiding unnecessary harm or unpredictable reactions. The notification preparation phase was also when the team confronted the delicate boundary between the duty of transparency and the responsibility to protect privacy, as every detail needed careful consideration to prevent turning an investigative conclusion into an unprepared shock. In this temporary pause, the case existed in a special transitional state, where truth had been confirmed but not yet communicated, and where every action awaited the right moment to ensure scientific conclusion translated into humane action. Margaret's identity, once an open question in a cold case file, had now become a fully confirmed reality, carrying the weight of decades of waiting, loss, and hope, and that very weight made the identity confirmation phase not just a technical step in the investigative process, but a pivotal milestone, laying the foundation for what would follow in closing a case once seen as unsolvable. The firmly confirmed identity placed the investigative team before the most sensitive task since the case was reopened: contacting the Ramirez family, who had lived for decades in a state of waiting without answers, and now had to face a truth capable of upending their entire perception of the past. Choosing the method and timing of contact was not done hastily, as the team was fully aware that this information was not just investigative value, but a psychological shock, potentially reawakening wounds that had never fully healed. The Ramirez family was identified as the party to be approached directly, in a private setting and with the presence of specialized support professionals to ensure the information was conveyed clearly, honestly, but without causing unnecessary additional harm. Before contact occurred, psychological preparation for all parties was prioritized, not only for the biological family but also for Margaret herself, as identity confirmation did not mean everyone was ready to accept its consequences. Psychological support experts were consulted to predict possible reactions, from shock, denial, excessive hope, to long-suppressed guilt or anger, and to build an approach framework that minimized the risk of these reactions spiraling out of control. When the information was conveyed to the Ramirez family, initial reactions did not follow a single script but were a complex interweaving of emotions, where hope thought extinguished was suddenly reignited, yet accompanied by fear that reopening this door might lead to another loss if expectations went unmet. The family had to confront the reality that the child they lost years ago was not only alive but had grown up in a completely different life, and that very time gap made reunion impossible to simply envision as an intact return. In the first reactions, skepticism mixed with hope emerged naturally, as the family needed time to process that the investigative conclusion was not an assumption or remote possibility, but the result of rigorous, scientific and legal verification. Confirming the desire to meet was not posed as a requirement or forced expectation, but as a choice to be carefully considered by all involved parties, as the team understood that truth could be confirmed on paper, but emotional readiness was an entirely different matter. The Ramirez family was given space to ask questions, express concerns, and even voice hesitation, as reuniting with a child absent for decades was not just a moment of joy, but a confrontation with all the lost years, decisions made, and questions never fully answered. Throughout this process, the investigative team acted as intermediaries, neither pressuring nor steering emotions in a predetermined direction, but focusing on providing accurate information and supporting parties in making decisions suited to their psychological state. When the desire to meet was confirmed from the Ramirez family, the next step was carefully planning the reunion, viewing it not as the end of a case but the beginning of a new deeply human complex phase. This plan included determining the timing, location, and format of the meeting, as well as preparing necessary support measures to ensure the encounter, however profound, did not become an additionally traumatizing experience for anyone. Throughout the preparation, balancing the right to know the truth with the right to protection from further harm remained the guiding principle for every decision, as the team recognized there was no completely right or completely safe way to handle such a profoundly human situation. The Ramirez family, having lived in the silence of a cold case file, now had to learn to prepare for the possibility of reconnecting with a loved one who had existed beyond their awareness for decades, while Margaret also had to face the reality that her biological origins were no longer an abstract concept but specific people carrying their own history, memories, and expectations. The notification phase was thus not merely conveying an investigative conclusion, but a highly sensitive transitional process where truth was presented step by step, enveloped in psychological preparation and respect for individual choices to create conditions for a reunion, if it occurred, to take place in the least harmful context possible. After the desire to meet had been confirmed by both sides, and the reunion plan carefully constructed, the entire process entered its most sensitive phase, where all prior investigative efforts transformed into a deeply human encounter, far exceeding the framework of an ordinary criminal case. Preparations for the meeting focused not only on logistics or security, but primarily on creating a psychologically safe space where the parties could face each other without pressure to display emotions according to any predetermined pattern. The chosen location was neutral, detached from spaces tied to painful memories or institutional authority, to minimize feelings of control and allow interactions to unfold as naturally as possible. Before the meeting, psychologists worked separately with each side to help them envision possible emotional scenarios, not to prepare for an ideal outcome, but to emphasize that awkwardness, silence, or a sense of strangeness were entirely normal responses in the context of a reunion after decades of separation. This preparation also helped lower hidden expectations, preventing the meeting from being burdened with the need to immediately heal or compensate for the lost time. When the in-person meeting took place, there was no single explosive moment or uniform emotional reaction, but rather a series of fragmented moments, where glances, gestures, and pauses carried more meaning than words. The Ramirez family faced Margaret as a complete person, no longer the fixed image of the 2-year-old child in their memory, and this very difference forced them to readjust their understanding of reunion, from a complete return to an encounter between individuals who had developed independently in entirely different circumstances. For Margaret, standing before people who shared her blood, but were strangers in experience, created a profound inner conflict, where curiosity, emotion, and caution coexisted side by side, with no one fully overpowering the others. Observing experts noted that in the initial phase, defensive psychological reactions appeared on both sides, not due to lack of goodwill, but because the brain needed time to process a reality far beyond the familiar. Psychological responses were assessed continuously and discreetly, not to interfere with the natural flow of the meeting, but to be ready to provide support if signs of emotional overload emerged, such as overwhelm, disorientation, or a tendency to withdraw completely. These reactions were viewed as an inevitable part of the reconnection process, reflecting the complexity of re-establishing bonds after such vast gaps in time and experience. As the meeting progressed, interactions gradually shifted from initial caution to more careful exchanges, where the parties began testing new ways of communicating, seeking common ground without denying the differences that had formed. In this context, adjusting expectations became a key factor, not only mentioned beforehand, but reinforced through the actual experience of the reunion. The Ramirez family had to confront the reality that they could not reclaim the roles they had lost in Margaret's life, and that any continuing relationship would need to be built on respect for her boundaries and autonomy as an adult. Margaret, in turn, needed to clearly define her own emotional boundaries, distinguishing between acknowledging her biological origins and any emotional obligations she was not required to assume if not ready. This adjustment process did not unfold smoothly or entirely consciously, but through moments of trial and error, as the parties realized that striving for an ideal reunion image could create more pressure than accepting a relationship that developed slowly and uncertainly. For the investigative team, the reunion marked the functional end of the search phase, as the core objective of identifying the victim's whereabouts and identity had been achieved. However, this conclusion was not seen as complete success in the traditional sense, as the team was fully aware that no action of theirs could restore the lost years or erase the lasting psychological consequences for those involved. Instead, ending the search phase was understood as closing a decades-long chapter of uncertainty, allowing the individuals to move into a new state where the truth had been clarified, but how to live with that truth was still being shaped. For the Ramirez family, ending the search brought a complex form of relief, not pure joy, but a mixture of release, regret, and awareness that Margaret's life had unfolded beyond their reach for so long. For Margaret, the reunion did not close the story of her identity, but shifted it to another phase, where the question was no longer who she was, but how she would integrate this truth into her current life. The reunion thus served not as a simple emotional climax, but as a complex intersection, where the formal investigation concluded, making way for a longer personal and family journey, without a ready-made map and irresolvable by investigative methods or legal conclusions. In this context, ending the search phase did not mean all tensions were resolved, but marked a shift from pursuing the truth to learning to live with it, where each side had to determine the pace, boundaries, and meaning of the newly re-established connection, acknowledging that not every fracture could be fully mended, but recognizing and facing them was already a significant step forward, after years submerged in silence and uncertainty. When the reunion ended and direct presence was no longer supported by the controlled structure of the investigative process, the involved parties entered a new, more complex phase, where the true impacts of reconnection began to reveal themselves clearly in everyday life. Adapting to the new relationship did not follow a straight line or unified process, but consisted of a series of small repeated adjustments, where each interaction required balancing the desire for closeness with the need for self-protection. The Ramirez family had to learn to approach Margaret not as parents who had lost and regained a child, but as relatives facing a fully grown individual with her own history, choices, and limits, while Margaret had to confront the fact that the confirmed existence of her biological family did not automatically translate into emotional familiarity. This adaptation process was frequently interrupted by moments of misunderstanding or unspoken expectations, as each side unconsciously imposed on the other images accumulated over years of waiting or absence. Personal identity conflicts became more pronounced in the post-reunion phase, as Margaret had to integrate a new truth into the self-structure built over decades, where legal, social, and emotional identity had previously existed in relative stability. Knowing who she was biologically did not immediately resolve who she was in her current life, but instead gave rise to inner conflicts as she balanced the discovered past with the life she was living. These conflicts were not only personal, but also affected how she positioned herself in surrounding relationships, as deciding whether to share her origin story became a carefully weighed choice. For the Ramirez family, identity conflict manifested in adjusting their self-view, from parents living in the memory of loss to relatives who needed to learn presence without imposition, a transition requiring the release of many images and expectations nurtured over a long time. The long-term psychological impacts of the reunion did not fully emerge in the early days, but gradually appeared over time, as initial excitement subsided, and the parties faced the reality that there was no clear endpoint to this adaptation process. Margaret might experience phases of emotional fluctuation, where relief from knowing the truth, mixed with fatigue, from constantly readjusting her self-view and relationships with others. The Ramirez family, meanwhile, might feel a new emptiness, as the search goal was achieved, but the hoped-for relationship could not develop quickly or as imagined. These psychological impacts, if not recognized and supported promptly, could lead to emotional withdrawal or prolonged stress, weakening the potential for building a lasting relationship in the future. Recognizing this, psychological and legal support forms were introduced as essential parts of the post-reunion phase, not only to address emerging issues, but to create a safe framework for continued interaction, without being swept into uncontrolled emotional cycles. Psychological support helped the parties understand that difficult reactions were not signs of failure or lack of goodwill, but natural consequences of a traumatic event spanning years, and that seeking help did not diminish the value of the relationship being built. Legal support, meanwhile, clarified rights and obligations related to identity, privacy, and personal decisions, ensuring reconnection did not lead to unintended legal ties or invisible pressure on Margaret to meet others' expectations. This support did not aim to impose a specific direction, but to provide the parties with necessary tools to make choices suited to their circumstances and capacities. Changes in the parties' lives became clearer as the post-reunion phase extended, when the story of disappearance and reunion was no longer the sole central event, but became part of a broader everyday context. Margaret might need to readjust personal plans, not out of obligation, but from the need to understand and reorder her priorities in light of the new truth, while the Ramirez family had to learn to live with Margaret's presence in a non-intrusive way, accepting that the relationship might develop slowly, intermittently, or in forms different from initial hopes. The lives of all parties thus changed, not through dramatic turning points, but through subtle adjustments in how they viewed the past, present, and future, where clarified truth served
Not as a final answer,
but as the starting point for a longer process of adaptation, healing, and redefinition. The post-reunion phase showed that resolving a cold case does not end at the reunion moment, but extends into psychological, social, and personal consequences that no investigative conclusion can fully close, and it is in this space that the parties must find their own way to coexist with each other and with the truth, with necessary support, but no ready-made map for the road ahead. As the post-reunion phase gradually stabilized and the involved parties began learning to live with the clarified truth, the case returned to another axis of questions, less healing-oriented, but no less important: where does criminal responsibility lie? And is there still any possibility of identifying the perpetrator in an incident where time has eroded nearly all direct traces? Assessing the feasibility of identifying the perpetrator was approached by the cold case unit with a realistic attitude, no longer based on emotional expectations or public pressure, but on sober consideration of what the current justice system can and cannot achieve. Confirming that Margaret was alive and establishing her identity resolved the case's biggest question, but simultaneously exposed the clear limits of criminal investigation when facing an act that occurred in the social, legal, and technological context of the 1970s. Investigators reviewed the entire file with the sole goal of determining whether any reasonable path remained to trace back from the current outcome to a specific individual or action responsible for removing Margaret from her biological family, and the results of this review revealed structural gaps that were nearly impossible to fill. Examining the initial investigation's shortcomings became an unavoidable part of this process, not to criticize past decisions, but to understand why those gaps existed, and why they continued to affect the ability to pursue accountability today. The original investigation was conducted without modern forensic tools, without interconnected databases for missing children, without effective identity tracking systems, and especially without the ability to store, preserve, and analyze biological evidence to today's standards. These factors meant many potential leads were not fully documented or could not be verified later, creating a chain of breaks that no modern technology could fully repair. Remaining hypotheses were reclassified by feasibility, from highly speculative scenarios to possibilities with internal logic but lacking direct evidence. Some hypotheses suggested Margaret may have been taken by a stranger exploiting a lapse in supervision, while others focused on the possibility she was removed by someone with legal or semi-legal access, in a context where adoption controls, temporary guardianship, and identity changes had many loopholes. However, even though these hypotheses could reasonably explain Margaret appearing under a new identity without detection, they still could not be supported by evidence strong enough to meet the legal standard for a criminal charge. The inability to identify a specific suspect was not due to lack of effort, but to the combination of time, initial data shortages, and the reality that many potentially involved individuals, if they existed, may have died, lost legal capacity, or left no traceable legal trail. Current legal limits further clarified the infeasibility of closing the case in the traditional criminal direction, as statutes of limitations, evidence standards, and defendant rights set thresholds the case could hardly surpass in its present state. Even if an individual could be identified as the primary suspect, proving criminal conduct after decades would require the existence of physical evidence or reliable testimony that the file no longer retained. Investigators were thus forced to confront an unpalatable reality that the justice system, despite doing everything possible under current conditions, might not deliver a conviction or specific finding of guilt for the act that caused lifelong disruption for many people. The possibility of not fully closing the case became a conclusion seriously considered, not as abandoning responsibility, but as an honest acknowledgement of criminal investigation's limits when time has removed the elements needed for traditional justice. For the Ramirez family, this meant facing an incomplete form of justice, where the most important truth was clarified but questions of individual responsibility remained unanswered. Their pain of loss was no longer fueled by uncertainty, but persisted in the form of unanswerable why and who questions, forcing them to seek closure in forms outside the legal system. For Margaret, the lack of an identified perpetrator carried more complex meaning, as the need to understand the circumstances that removed her from her biological family was not necessarily tied to a desire for punishment, but to completing her life story. Accepting that part of the truth might forever remain out of reach required a psychological adaptation no less difficult than accepting the newly confirmed identity. In this context, the Cold Case Unit chose to transparently document the unresolved questions in the official file, rather than force a formal conclusion, ensuring the case history was reflected truthfully, including both what was clarified and what could not be. This approach acknowledged that investigative value lies not only in securing convictions, but also in clarifying truth to the maximum possible extent, thereby restoring to the involved parties the right to know and the right to ask questions. Margaret Ramirez's case thus stands as a typical modern cold case, where new technology and methods can resolve the core aspects of the victim's fate, but cannot fully reverse the consequences of time and historical shortcomings. Acknowledging the possibility of incomplete closure does not diminish the value of what was achieved, but instead places the case in a more mature view of justice, where truth, acknowledgement, and the ability to continue living with unanswered questions are seen as valid outcomes, though imperfect. It is in this space that the case reaches a distinctive form of conclusion, not through a verdict or punishment, but through transparency about what can and cannot be achieved, allowing the involved individuals to move from waiting for answers to actively seeking meaning and closure in their own way, alongside the silences that history has left unfilled. As the investigative process reached the point where all collectible data had been exploited, and all answerable questions had been addressed within feasible limits, the Margaret Ramirez case can be viewed as a complete whole, fully reflecting the life cycle of a decades-long missing person case, from the initiating moment to the stage of redefining the meaning of justice. Summarizing the case process reveals a logically connected yet highly contingent series of phases, beginning with a disappearance occurring in a social context that trusted in safety, where initial responses were dominated by habit and subjectivity, leading to irreversible limitations in evidence collection. The original investigation, though conducted with considerable effort for its era, remained constrained by technological, legal, and perceptual limits, causing the case to quickly reach an impasse and be classified as unsolved. Maintaining the file over the years, though yielding no specific progress, inadvertently became the key factor, allowing the case to be revisited when social and scientific conditions changed, proving that even passive waiting can hold value if data is not lost. Reopening the file did not follow the traditional model of new witnesses or confessions, but was triggered by the victim's own need to explore her origins, demonstrating the increasingly tight link between individual rights and the ability to resolve historical cases. In this overall picture, genetic genealogy emerged as the pivotal factor, not only for providing a new technical tool, but for completely transforming the approach to identity and biological connection in criminal investigation. Genetic genealogy allowed overcoming barriers once seen as insurmountable, such as excessive time passage, legal identity changes, and administrative record breaks, by tracing truth backward from the indelible human biological structure. In this case, genetic genealogy did not function as a standalone linear proof, but as a convergence point, where biological data, geographic information, and historical records intersected, creating an entirely new investigative direction when all old ones were exhausted. The significance of this tool lies not in replacing traditional methods, but in adding a depth previously absent, enabling the restructuring of cases thought permanently frozen. For other missing person cases, especially children who disappeared without direct evidence, the Margaret Ramirez case sends a clear message that resolution potential should not be judged solely on the current file state. It shows that preserving data, maintaining access, and readiness to re-evaluate old assumptions are vital, as what is unclear today may become feasible tomorrow with changing technology and approaches. At the same time, the case emphasizes that resolving a disappearance does not necessarily require identifying the perpetrator or securing a conviction, as in many instances, restoring identity and truth about the victim's fate already constitutes a deeply valuable form of justice. The case's impact on the investigative system appears on multiple levels, from promoting coordination between cold case units and civilian data sources, to setting new requirements for training investigators in handling biological analysis tools and big data. The case also exposed undeniable limits of the justice system, as time can eliminate the ability to pursue criminal accountability, forcing the system to acknowledge that not every case can close in the traditional punitive justice model. This acknowledgement does not weaken the system's value, but instead allows it to operate more honestly with achievable outcomes, avoiding unrealistic expectations for historical cases. Lessons drawn from the case are not only technical or legal, but also carry ethical and social depth, raising questions about how society treats missing persons and their families during long periods of waiting. The case shows that administrative silence should not equate to forgetting, and that officially noting a case's unresolved status can be the first step in keeping future resolution possible. It also clarifies the increasingly active role of individuals in seeking truth about themselves, as technology enables those once merely subjects of files to become agents initiating reopening and shifting the system's entire approach. On the human level, summarizing the Margaret Ramirez case shows that resolving a cold case does not end at the reunion or identity confirmation moment, but extends into psychological, social, and personal consequences that no investigative conclusion can fully close. Clarified truth brings the power of choice, rather than imposing a single emotional outcome, allowing involved parties to shape how they continue living with what they now know. It is at this point that the case's deepest meaning emerges, showing that justice in missing person cases is not solely about finding who did what, but also about restoring to people the right to know who they are, what happened, and from there to actively write the rest of their lives in the light of truth, even if that light does not illuminate every shadow of the past. The story of Margaret Ramirez shows that in today's America, safety is no longer the subjective feeling it was in Henderson, Nevada, in 1975, where neighbors knew each other's faces and adults believed turning their backs for a few minutes was fine. In this case, it was precisely the moment a witness hesitated, reassured themselves about an unusual detail, and responded too slowly that created the few-minute gap, allowing Margaret to vanish silently. The first lesson is very practical with young children. Treat every off-pattern signal as worth checking immediately. A stranger lingering too long, an out-of-context greeting, a loitering vehicle, and prioritize small but decisive actions. Bring the child inside. Call another adult. Note descriptions, license plates over fear of overreacting. The second lesson concerns the system. The Ramirez family reported to police, but lacking cameras, DNA, and an evidence-poor scene caused the case to quickly stall. In modern America, you can reduce cold case risk through habits like keeping updated photos of your child, identification descriptions, basic medical records, and teaching age-appropriate safety skills. Find staff with name tags, memorize family phone numbers. The third lesson is about identity. Margaret grew up with inconsistent paperwork and unlinked medical school records, signs that made her feel out of place and eventually led her to take a genetic genealogy test. This reminds us, if you have gaps in documentation, don't suffer alone. Seek legal and psychological support early. Finally, reunion does not heal instantly. It requires adjusting expectations, respecting boundaries, and using professional support. In American culture that values individual rights, the biggest lesson is protecting safety and truth is not about panic, but about proactivity, from prevention and documentation to daring to explore origins and seeking system support at the right time. If you found the story of Margaret Ramirez gave you a new perspective on missing person cases and the power of truth after decades, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next cold case files. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue searching for the truth behind stories that seemed forever forgotten.